Welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 92 of ASP.NET video series. This is continuation to part 91. If you haven't watched that part, I would strongly encourage you to do so before continuing with the session. In this session, we'll discuss about authenticating users against a list that's stored in a database table. In part 90, we discussed about authenticating users against a list that is stored in web.config file. Now, that was easy to do because forms authentication class exposes a static method called authenticate. Now, to that method, we pass in the username and password, and the authenticate method will take the responsibility of comparing that username and password with the list that's stored in the web.config file. So it was pretty much easy to do. In part 91, we discussed about registering users to a database table. Okay, if they don't already have a username and password, we have discussed about how to register them with our application. In this session, we'll discuss about authenticating users against a list that's stored in a database table. So obviously, if we have to authenticate users against a list that's stored in a database table, then we will have to do all the hard work in terms of writing the stored procedure to authenticating users, and then to invoke that stored procedure from the .NET application. Let's see how to do that with an example. Let's flip to Visual Studio. Now in SQL Server, we have this table called TBL users. At the moment, we don't have any users, but if you remember in the previous session, we have discussed about registering users. So if you haven't watched that part, I would strongly encourage you to do so. So let me go ahead and run this application and register a user. So I am on the login page. Let me click on this link, click here to register. And on the registration page, we can provide the details. Let's say I want a username of test, password of test, and the confirm password test, and the email is going to be test@test.com. Click register. Now let's go ahead and check the users table. Okay, so we have a test user there. Now what I want to do is I want to enable, I want to basically authenticate against this list that I have in the database. Now in part 90, we discussed about authenticating users against a list that's stored in web.config file. So if you look at this web.config file, I have some users here. In part 90, we have discussed how to authenticate users that are stored here. But in reality, do we really store user list in web.config file? No. So this is not a practical thing to do. So let me go ahead and remove these users here, because we are not going to use them anymore. We are going to make use of the users that are there in the database. Okay, and then if you look at the login page at the moment, so let's get to the login page. So on the login page, so we are using that authenticate method of the forms authentication class, which takes this username and password, compares that with the list that's there in the web.config file. But now we don't want to do that. We want to be authenticating users against this list that we have in the database. So the first thing to do is obviously to create a stored procedure which will take in username and password as the parameters, authenticate them, and return the whether the authentication is successful or not. So just to save some time in typing, I have the stored procedure already created. So let me copy and paste it there. So if you look at the stored procedure, the name of the stored procedure is sp authenticate user. It takes in two input parameters, both of type nvarchar, username and password. What are we doing here? We are creating a variable of type integer at count. So this is the key statement. So select at count is equal to count of username from TBL users, where username is equal to whatever parameter that we are passing in, the username and password. So if there is a match for the username and password that we have passed into the stored procedure, then this count will be at least 1. So if the count is 1, then we know that the username and password that we have passed into the stored procedure matched with one of the entries in TBL users table. Okay, so if there is a match, then I'm selecting 1 as return code, otherwise -1 as return code. 1 means the user is successfully authenticated, -1 means it's an invalid username and password. So what we will do, we will invoke the stored procedure from our .NET application. So let me go ahead and create the stored procedure. Okay, so there is an incorrect syntax. That's because we are missing a comma there. So let's put that comma. Press F5, command completed successfully. So we should have that stored procedure. Let's refresh the stored procedure folder. So sp authenticate user. Now we need to go ahead and authenticate, we need to go ahead and call the stored procedure from the .NET application. But let's quickly test if it's working as expected. So if you remember, within this database I have test user, and this password is encrypted basically. So let me copy both of these and then use them as the parameters here. So test is the password and test is the username, and that's the password. Password is basically encrypted. So let's test this. So I'm passing in the right password. Okay, let's put a comma there to separate the parameters. Let's execute this now. Okay, return code is 1. On the other hand, if I just enter some new characters in the password, it should return -1. Press F5 -1. So the stored procedure is working as expected. All we have to do right now is to invoke that stored procedure. Again, just to save some time in typing, I have written this method. Again, it's pretty simple and straightforward ADO.NET code. If you haven't watched the series on ADO.NET, I would strongly encourage you to do so. Okay, so I'm having a private method here, a private method that returns boolean true or false, and the name of the method is authenticate user. And what is this method going to do? This method is taking in two parameters, username and password. Okay, both of them are type string, and then we are creating the connection string and creating the SQL connection object, creating the instance of SQL command, and we are telling we want to invoke the stored procedure sp authenticate user. Since this is a stored procedure, we are specifying the command type as stored procedure, and then this procedure expects two parameters, at username and password. So we need to create those two parameters here, at username, at password. And then the values for the parameters are coming in as input parameters into this method. So wherever we invoke this method, we will pass the values for this username and password parameters. So those are the two values there for those two parameters, and we are then associating that parameter objects with the command object. And finally open the connection and then return code. We are retrieving the return code. Look at that. The stored procedure returns a single value. Okay, whether it is 1 or -1, it returns a single value. That's why we are invoking the execute scalar method, and the return type of execute scalar is object type, but we know that we are expecting an integer. That's why I'm safely typecasting that to be of type integer. And then look at that, what you are doing. See, ultimately this method should return a true or false. True if the user is authenticated, false if the user is not authenticated. So we know that if this stored procedure returns 1, that means the user is successfully authenticated. So we are comparing the return code with 1. Return code is equal to 1. So this expression that I have highlighted should return a true if the return code is 1, otherwise it returns a false, because -1 is not equal to 1, so that returns a false. Okay, so all that is left out right now is to invoke this method. So within the login click button, initially we were using the authenticate method of the forms authentication class, but now since we want to authenticate users against a list that's stored in the database, instead of using that method, all I'm going to do at the moment is replace that with this authenticate user method. So we are invoking that method authenticate user. We are passing in the username from the text box and password from that text box. That said, if this method returns true, we are redirecting the user from the forms from the login page. Okay, else we will show invalid username and password to message to the end user. That's it. So all we have done until now is created the stored procedure, which is simple and straightforward. And then we invoked that stored procedure in this private method. Within the login button click, we invoked this method instead of the authenticate method of the forms authentication class. Okay, so let me go ahead, save these changes, run the application, and see if it works as expected. So the username is test, so let me type in test. Let me type in a wrong password first and click login. Look at that, invalid username and a password. On the other hand, let me type in the correct password. It is still saying invalid username and password, and guess why? Okay, look at that. I am typing in the right password, but I still get the same message. That is because if you remember, the passwords in this table are encrypted. But then look at how we are passing in the passwords to the database. Okay, we are retrieving whatever the user has typed in the text box, passing them to this method authenticate user. Okay, so we are passing in the password there, and the way we are passing it to the, look at this, this is the SQL parameter that is taking that value and passing it to the stored procedure. Now if I type in the text box test as the password, so it will be passed as test to the stored procedure. Now if I pass the value test to the stored procedure as the password, will this return 1? No, because why? The password that's stored in the database is encrypted. So if I press execute, it returns -1. It doesn't match with the password that I have there within the database. So before comparison, I actually have to encrypt the password and then pass it. And how do I do that within the forms authentication class? We have hash password for storing in config file method. We have discussed about this in the previous session. So we give it the password and specify the hashing algorithm. It's going to hash that password and return that as encrypted password. So let me create a variable and let's store in that. So encrypted password is equal to that, and we want to pass the password into this method, so I'm going to pass that. And we also need to specify the hashing algorithm. We used SHA1 when we were registering the user, so we need to use the same algorithm. Okay, so if you remember on the registration page, when we were registering the user, we used SHA1 as the hashing algorithm, and we are using the same here. And then what we need to do, we need to pass that encrypted password for comparison to the stored procedure. Okay, that's it. With this change now, let's go ahead and run this. Now when we enter the password, it will encrypt that and then send it across. So test and test. I click login. Now look at this, invalid value um, for password format parameter. Oh yeah, look at that. It should be SHA1, not SAH1. Let's correct that. SHA1. So let's run this once again. The algorithm is SHA1. So test and test is the password. I click login. Look at that. We are on the login page. Okay, so in this session, we discussed about authenticating users against a list that's stored in the database table. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.